Markham, Ontario, November 8, 2010. Just after 10 p.m., a family sat inside their home, believing they were safe. Minutes later, safety was shattered. No doors kicked in, no windows broken. Yet terror still walked through their front door. And when the silence finally broke, it wasn't comfort the world heard. It was a daughter's voice on the line with 911, a voice that raised more questions than it answered. Hui Han Pan and Bitch Ha Pan had worked themselves into exhaustion for decades in Canada. He worked at an auto parts factory. She worked at a manufacturing plant. Their lives revolved around long shifts, small paychecks, and the dream of giving their children more than they ever had. They lived frugally, saving every dollar and investing every ounce of energy into one thing, their family. By the late 1990s, their sacrifices were visible. The family owned a modest but well-kept home in Markham, Ontario, a suburb known for safety and quiet streets. To neighbors, the Pans looked like the model of discipline and success. Their daughter Jennifer seemed to embody everything her parents had worked toward: polite, talented, and by all accounts, a gifted student. Their son Felix followed closely behind, focused and reserved. Inside the walls of that home, however, life was ruled by rules. Education was not just important, it was non-negotiable. Hui Han and Bitch Ha believed their children's worth would be measured by grades, degrees, and careers in medicine or law. Television was restricted. Outings with friends were limited. Failure was not tolerated. Praise came with achievement. Disappointment followed any stumble. For Jennifer, who struggled quietly with academics, every report card felt like a test of love. To the outside world, she was thriving. She practiced piano, competed in figure skating, and appeared on track to fulfill the expectations placed upon her. Her parents proudly told friends of her accomplishments, certain their hard work had produced a daughter destined for greatness. But Jennifer was already learning a dangerous skill: how to hide her truth. Small lies began early. A mark adjusted, a story stretched, a failure disguised as success. Each deception protected her from her parents' disappointment, but each one also drew her further from reality. In the Pan household, honesty became harder than achievement. And as Jennifer grew older, those small lies would grow with her, until they became the foundation of a life that was more illusion than truth. Jennifer Pan grew up in Markham as the quiet child who seemed to embody everything her parents wanted. To neighbors, she was polite and soft-spoken, a girl who never broke rules, never caused trouble. Her teachers described her as well-mannered, focused, and diligent. To her parents, she was the symbol of their sacrifices. The daughter who would turn their years of struggle into something permanent, something worthy. On the surface, Jennifer looked like every parent's dream. But inside, she carried a weight that only grew heavier as the years went on. From the beginning, Jennifer was enrolled in lessons designed to shape her into a star. She skated on cold rinks before dawn, practicing jumps and spins under the sharp eyes of instructors. She sat at the piano for hours, drilling scales, perfecting notes, learning to perform with flawless posture. Report cards were framed as proof of her progress, and achievements were celebrated as confirmation that the Pan family's sacrifices had been worth it. She smiled through it all, nodding when praised, bowing her head when corrected. On paper, she was thriving. But paper can be altered, and Jennifer knew that early. School was her battlefield, and she was losing. Math and science baffled her. Test results came back marked in red. While classmates seemed to advance with ease, Jennifer lagged behind, caught in the struggle between expectation and reality. At home, failure was not an option. Her father demanded straight A's. Her mother spoke proudly of her accomplishments to neighbors. The gap between who she was and who she was supposed to be grew wider with every passing year. So she created her own solution. The first time, it was a single grade, changed with careful strokes of a pen. AB became an A. Her parents never questioned it. Their pride in her report card drowned out any doubt. Jennifer realized then that the truth was too dangerous to reveal, and deception was safer. What began as one forgery became a pattern. Report cards were altered, stories were invented, excuses rehearsed. Lying became her shield. It was how she avoided shame, how she preserved her parents' belief that she was exceptional. In her mind, it wasn't betrayal. It was survival. The lies gave Jennifer room to breathe, but they also built walls around her. Every forged grade meant another story to maintain, another detail to remember. She learned to prepare her fabrications as carefully as she practiced her skating routines. She planned responses to her parents' questions, studied her own falsehoods until they felt natural. Soon, deception wasn't an emergency tactic. It was her way of life. To outsiders, none of this was visible. Her parents continued to tell family friends that Jennifer was excelling, preparing for a future in medicine. Teachers complimented her manners, her poise, her dedication. Relatives admired her as the ideal daughter of immigrant parents, hardworking, talented, destined for success. Jennifer nodded and smiled, but each word of praise cut deeper, reminding her of the widening gap between appearance and truth. She lived in two worlds, the perfect daughter everyone believed in, and the struggling student who existed only in silence. At home, the pressure never eased. Her father, Hui Han, expected nothing less than perfection. Her mother, Bitch Ha, echoed his standards with firm encouragement. Their intentions were not cruel. They wanted Jennifer to succeed, to climb higher than they had ever dreamed. But the weight of those expectations pressed down on Jennifer until she could no longer distinguish between love and achievement. She began to believe that approval was conditional, tied only to grades and accomplishments. To be imperfect was to risk losing their pride. And so she buried every failure beneath layers of lies, determined to keep their love intact. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Jennifer sometimes sat in her room replaying the day. The forged marks, the proud smiles, the stories told. Relief mingled with guilt. She was safe for now, but she knew the illusion could collapse at any moment. Each lie bought her more time, but also bound her more tightly to the cycle. The fear of discovery became constant, gnawing at her even when she smiled in front of others. Yet she kept going, because stopping meant facing the truth, and to her, that truth was unbearable. As the years passed, Jennifer's skills in deception sharpened. She intercepted letters from school, crafted fake schedules, and invented achievements that did not exist. Her fabrications grew more elaborate, each one stacked on the last. She became a master at controlling appearances, weaving together stories that convinced everyone around her. But with every success in deception came deeper isolation. No one truly knew her. No one could see the child behind the lies. And Jennifer, caught between fear and longing, convinced herself that pretending was the only way forward. This was the contradiction of Jennifer Pan. She longed for love, yet feared she could only earn it through deception. She craved approval, yet buried the truth of her struggles. She appeared obedient, yet lived a secret life built on lies. To her parents, she was the promise of their future. To herself, she was a fraud desperate not to be exposed. The longer she lived in this contradiction, the more it defined her. Jennifer's early years paint a portrait of a girl trapped in expectations too high to meet and too heavy to escape. Her lies were not random. They were deliberate, calculated, rehearsed. Each one allowed her to move forward, but each one also set her further apart from reality. What began as a small adjustment on a grade sheet evolved into a full double life. And though she smiled on the outside, Jennifer knew the mask could not last forever. High school became the stage where Jennifer Pan's double life solidified. The casual fibs of childhood hardened into deliberate deception, and the weight of expectation pressed harder than ever before. Hui-Han Pan demanded straight A's, and nothing less. He believed discipline built strength, and to him, success was a measure of respect for the sacrifices he and his wife had endured since arriving in Canada. Anything short of excellence was treated as weakness, and in Jennifer's world, weakness was unforgivable. Her first act of forgery was almost instinctive. A test grade, lower than her father would accept, sat mocking her from the page. She stared at the paper, fear twisting in her chest, then carefully reshaped the number with her pen. A 73 became a 93. It was a small act, quick and precise, but when she handed the report over, her father's face softened in satisfaction. He nodded once, folded the paper, and said nothing more. Relief rushed through Jennifer like oxygen, but it was not the relief of success. It was the relief of escape. At that moment, she realized the truth could be rewritten, and deception could buy her the love she craved. What began as one alteration soon became routine. Report cards were adjusted before they ever reached her parents' hands. Letters from teachers were intercepted, corrected, and delivered only after Jennifer ensured they matched the image her father demanded. She learned how to mimic handwriting, practiced signatures until they looked authentic, and even created fake awards to keep the illusion intact. Each lie was rehearsed, each story calculated, and with every successful performance, Jennifer built more confidence in her ability to control the narrative of her life. Lying was no longer a desperate act, it became a craft. To outsiders, nothing seemed amiss. Jennifer continued with piano lessons, skating practice, and community performances. Teachers who noticed her struggle in subjects like math and chemistry assumed her parents already knew. Her friends saw only a quiet girl under pressure, someone who studied late and avoided trouble. And to Hui Han and Bitch Ha, she remained their star. The daughter who achieved, who honored their sacrifices, who reflected the dream they had worked themselves ragged to build. They repeated her successes proudly to neighbors, unaware that those accomplishments were ink and invention. Inside Jennifer, however, the cost of the lies grew heavier. Each forged grade brought temporary relief, but also deeper isolation. She could never admit the truth without collapsing the world she had created. When her father praised her performance, she smiled, but inside she felt the sting of guilt. When her mother proudly shared her grades with others, Jennifer stayed silent, knowing every word was built on falsehoods. The gap between the truth and the story she told widened until it became a chasm she could no longer cross. Still, she pressed on. The risk of exposure was terrifying, yet the fear of failure was worse. Her father's disapproval cut sharper than any punishment, and Jennifer convinced herself that deception was safer than honesty. She rehearsed her fabrications with the same dedication she brought to the piano or the rink, ensuring her details never wavered. Over time, she grew so skilled that her lies blended seamlessly into reality. She no longer hesitated when asked about her grades. The answers rolled off her tongue as if they were fact. The girl her parents believed in was not real, yet Jennifer made her convincing enough to survive. When perfection is demanded, but failure is reality, the narrator reflects. Deception can become the bridge between the two. For Jennifer, that bridge was not temporary. It became the only way forward. Every report card forged, every number altered, was another step across it. She was building a future out of lies, stone by stone, unable to turn back without crumbling everything behind her. By the end of high school, Jennifer's entire identity rested on that fragile construction. Her parents believed she was excelling, her community admired her, and Jennifer herself clung to the illusion with trembling hands. In truth, she was failing in the very place her parents valued most. But the truth was buried under layers of careful ink, hidden behind smiles and nods. She had mastered the art of deception, and for now, no one suspected the storm gathering beneath the surface. Jennifer Pan first noticed Daniel Wong in the crowded halls of high school. He wasn't like the classmates who measured themselves by grades and test scores. Daniel carried himself with an ease that drew people in, confident, relaxed, and unconcerned with the rigid expectations that ruled Jennifer's life. While she spent her nights rehearsing piano scales and altering report cards, Daniel worked shifts at Boston Pizza and spent his free time surrounded by friends. To Jennifer, he represented something she had never known at home: freedom. Their connection began with small moments. Shared conversations between classes, late-night texts that stretched longer than either expected. For Jennifer, who had always been shy and eager to please, Daniel's attention was magnetic. He didn't care about her report cards, her skating competitions, or her parents' vision of medical school. He cared about her words, her feelings, her laughter. Around him, she didn't have to be the perfect daughter. She could stumble, joke, or admit weakness, and instead of judgment, she was met with acceptance. But inside the Pan household, love was measured differently. Hui Han and Bitch Ha valued structure, sacrifice, and achievement, and they expected the same of anyone close to their daughter. When they discovered she was seeing Daniel, their reaction was swift. Hui Han confronted her after overhearing one of their phone calls, his words clipped and stern. He told her Daniel would lead her astray, that he was a distraction from the future they had worked themselves into exhaustion to secure. Bitch Ha echoed the warning, reminding Jennifer that her only focus should be education. Their disapproval was firm, and it left no room for negotiation. Daniel Wong was not welcome in their daughter's life. Jennifer obeyed in appearance, but resisted in silence. She nodded when lectured, lowered her eyes when scolded, and gave every impression of compliance. Yet in truth, her parents' rejection only bound her to Daniel more tightly. What began as a teenage romance took on the weight of rebellion. Their relationship became secretive, hidden behind the same lies Jennifer already used to cover her fake university career. When she told her parents she was studying late at the library, she was often meeting Daniel. When she claimed to be attending group projects, she was sitting in his car, talking for hours, savoring the freedom that came with being herself. The secrecy deepened their bond. Jennifer whispered into the phone late at night, clutching it under her blankets, praying her father wouldn't enter the room. Messages buzzed constantly, hidden from view whenever footsteps approached. Daniel became the first person she texted in the morning and the last voice she heard before sleep. To her parents, she remained the diligent student. To Daniel, she was the girlfriend who confided her fears, her frustrations, and her dreams of escape. Each world was real to her in its own way, but they could not coexist, and Jennifer knew it. Daniel wasn't blind to her struggles. He listened when she spoke of her parents' strictness and offered reassurance that she didn't need to live under their control forever. He gave her the one thing her parents never had: unconditional acceptance. Unlike Hui Han, he didn't demand perfection. Unlike Bitch Ha, he didn't enforce discipline. He offered ease, warmth, and a future where she could live without pretending. For Jennifer, that contrast was irresistible. He wasn't just her boyfriend, he was her refuge. But refuge demanded deception. Every meeting, every phone call, every late-night text required another excuse. Jennifer's life was already a maze of lies, and now her relationship with Daniel was woven into that same maze. If she told her parents she had an exam, they believed her because the role of the hard-working student had been rehearsed so thoroughly. In truth, she was with Daniel, using her fake education as the perfect cover. The lies fed each other, growing stronger with every secret she kept. The more her parents tightened their rules, the more she drifted toward Daniel. Each stern warning, each disappointed glance pushed her further away. In their eyes, he was pulling her off course. In Jennifer's eyes, he was the only one who understood. The conflict inside the Pan household grew sharper, the silence heavier, the distance wider. Jennifer lived under her parents' roof, but her loyalty was already elsewhere. This was not just a romance, it was a fracture. Jennifer was no longer the obedient daughter they thought they had raised, nor was she only the carefree girlfriend Daniel Wong believed in. She was both, and neither, trapped in a storm of expectations and secrecy. And as her devotion to Daniel grew, so did her defiance toward her parents. Jennifer Pan had built her life on lies, and Daniel Wong became the center of them. To her parents, he was the distraction who threatened everything. To Jennifer, he was the proof that another life was possible. But how long could she carry both worlds? The daughter her parents celebrated and the young woman who lived only for Daniel. The answer was closing in, and when it came, it would tear the Pan family apart. For most families, graduation is a day of truth, the end of long nights, the reward for endless sacrifices. For the Pan family, it was supposed to be the moment they could finally breathe. Jennifer Pan told her parents she was graduating from Ryerson University, and they believed her without hesitation. She knew their pride demanded a symbol, something tangible, so she gave them one. She rented a cap and gown, arranged for photographs, and stood smiling before the camera with an empty diploma cover in her hands. To Hui Han and Bitch Ha, those images were proof that everything they had endured had been worth it. To Jennifer, they were props in a play she could no longer stop performing. The photos hung in the house like trophies. Neighbors were shown the images proudly, their daughter in black robes, her hair neat beneath the cap, her smile as bright as the future they imagined for her. Hui Han, a man of few words, allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Bitch Ha, more open in her joy, told friends and relatives that Jennifer was moving on to bigger things, that medical school was no longer a dream but a destination. In their eyes, she had not only met expectations, she had exceeded them. They spoke of her with pride, never once suspecting that behind those photographs was a truth too fragile to admit. Jennifer did not stop with staged images. She built an entire second act to her story. She told her parents she had secured internships at hospitals in Toronto, crafting schedules that mimicked the rotations of medical students. She carried a badge she had borrowed and modified, slipped hospital names into casual conversations, and even described imaginary supervisors with practiced detail. When her father asked about her shifts, she recited memorized accounts of patients she never met and procedures she never observed. To make her fabrications convincing, she borrowed terminology from friends actually studying in the field, weaving fragments of their stories into her own. Scholarships and awards soon followed, all fabricated, all carefully designed to maintain her parents' belief. She produced letters with forged signatures, complete with official-looking seals, and explained how her hard work had earned recognition. Hui Han accepted them with solemn pride, while Bitch Ha repeated the stories to others, her voice warm with the joy of a mother whose child had made good on every sacrifice. Their faith was absolute. Their pride blinded them. And Jennifer, desperate to maintain the illusion, gave them what they wanted, even as the lies pressed down heavier than ever. Each day became a performance. She left the house early, dressed as though heading to a hospital or research facility, her backpack filled with nothing but notebooks and props. Instead of medical rounds, she sat in cafes or libraries, staring at textbooks she never needed, watching real students rush to classes she had never taken. Sometimes she wandered aimlessly, killing time until the evening when she could return home with stories she had rehearsed. On the surface, she lived the life of a rising medical professional. In reality, she was trapped in the role of an actor who could never step off stage. The weight of the lies took a toll. Jennifer rehearsed her fabrications late into the night, whispering them to herself like lines from a script, terrified she would slip. Her hands trembled when her father asked too many questions. Her stomach knotted each time her mother proudly repeated her stories. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her chest tight with the fear that the next day might expose her. Guilt became her shadow, following her into every conversation, every smile, every moment of silence. Her parents never doubted her. To them, Jennifer's dedication was proof of character. Hui Han told colleagues at work that his daughter was well on her way to a medical career, speaking with rare pride. Bitch Ha showed her friends the staged graduation photos, her eyes glowing as she described her daughter's achievements. They believed completely, because not believing would mean admitting their sacrifices had been wasted. Their love for Jennifer was real, but it was built on an illusion they could not see through. Even as her parents celebrated, Jennifer knew the walls of her deception were closing in. The more she fabricated, the more tangled the web became. Every internship she invented demanded another story. Every scholarship required another forged document. She carried binders filled with fake schedules, kept folders of forged letters hidden away, and lived in constant fear that one misplaced page could expose everything. She had gone too far to turn back, but too deep to escape. The graduation photo on the mantel became a symbol of her undoing. To her parents, it was a reminder of success. To Jennifer, it was a constant accusation. Each time she walked past it, her chest tightened. Each time she saw her parents glance at it with pride, guilt stabbed sharper. The robe had been rented, the diploma cover empty, the smile a mask. And though her parents could not see it, Jennifer knew she was carrying a weight that would one day break her. For now, though, the illusion remained intact. Hui Han and Bitch Ha continued to tell neighbors about their daughter's future. Jennifer continued to leave the house each morning, carrying lies like luggage. To everyone else, the Pan family was thriving. Inside, one young woman lived with the crushing truth that her life was nothing but deception. And as her lies grew heavier, harder to carry, the question that lingered was no longer whether she would be exposed, but when. Jennifer Pan's carefully constructed world began to collapse the way most lies do, not with a single event, but with questions that could no longer be answered. Her father, Hui Han, had always believed in evidence. For years he had accepted Jennifer's stories because they came wrapped in the symbols he wanted to see: photos in a rented gown, fake letters about scholarships, schedules scribbled with assignments. But doubt began to stir when he asked for something she couldn't fabricate: official proof. A transcript, a certificate, a document that bore more weight than her words. At first, Jennifer stalled. She told him the registrar's office was delayed. She claimed the papers had been misplaced. She smiled nervously and hoped her deflections would be enough. But suspicion sharpened into certainty when Hui Han made the call himself. The registrar's voice on the other end was calm but unyielding. There was no record of Jennifer Pan at Ryerson University. No enrollment. No classes. No graduation. In that instant, the dream her parents had clung to for years disintegrated. The revelation hit the household like a storm. Bichha broke first. She wept openly, her hands covering her face, her body trembling with the kind of grief reserved for funerals. Her sobs filled the kitchen, echoing through the home that had been built on sacrifice and pride. She had bragged to neighbors about her daughter's success, repeated Jennifer's stories with joy, and now every word felt like humiliation. Her tears were not only for the betrayal, but for the loss of the future she had believed was secure. Hui Han's response was different, but no less devastating. He did not raise his voice or collapse under the weight of shock. Instead, he grew colder, his disappointment sharper than anger. He looked at Jennifer with eyes that once held pride and now held nothing but judgment. The silence between his words was worse than any shout. For a man who measured love through duty and achievement, the discovery was unforgivable. His daughter had not only failed, she had deceived him, and that wound cut deeper than failure ever could. Their response was swift. Jennifer was forbidden from seeing Daniel Wong, the one person who had become her refuge. They believed he had been part of her distraction, the reason her carefully planned path had unraveled. They imposed strict routines, stripping her days of freedom, monitoring her movements, ensuring she remained under their watch. Every hour was accounted for, every excuse challenged. She had lied her way into a fantasy, and now they intended to chain her to reality. Outwardly, Jennifer complied. She followed their rules, sat quietly at dinner, and nodded when her father spoke. She gave the appearance of obedience, the same way she had once given the appearance of success. But inside, something darker was taking root. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her fists clenched under the blanket. She bit her lips until they bled when her parents scolded her, holding back the words she wanted to scream. The anger simmered beneath her skin, unspoken but alive. Daniel had been more than a boyfriend. He had been her escape. With him, she had felt like herself, free from expectations, free from judgment. Now, that lifeline was severed. Her parents' discovery had not only stripped her of the lies she had built, but had also robbed her of the one place she could breathe. To them, the punishment was correction. To Jennifer, it felt like confinement, like being locked in a cell with no door. The tension inside the Pan household became unbearable. Meals were eaten in silence, the clinking of chopsticks against bowls filling the air where conversation once lived. Bichha's eyes, red from tears, lingered on Jennifer with sorrow, while Hui Han's gaze carried the weight of disappointment that words could never capture. Jennifer sat between them, her face still, her body tense, her mind spiraling. She appeared quiet, but her silence was not submission. It was the sound of anger hardening into resolve. This was the moment the balance shifted. Jennifer had lied to protect herself from disappointment, but now the lies were gone, and what remained was resentment. Her parents believed that control would heal the fracture, that discipline would restore order. Instead, their grip only pushed her further away. Each rule tightened the cage. Each warning deepened her defiance. What they saw as protection, she felt as suffocation. And in that suffocation, a dangerous thought began to form. Jennifer Pan's world had collapsed, but instead of rebuilding with truth, she allowed anger to take root in its place. Her parents wept, lectured, and enforced their rules, convinced they could save her. But Jennifer no longer wanted saving. She wanted freedom, and she was willing to pay any price for it. Quietly, in the stillness of her room, she began to imagine how she might take it back. Jennifer Pan's lies had unraveled, her parents' control had tightened, and now the one thread that held her together, her relationship with Daniel Wong, was beginning to fray. In the weeks after her parents discovered the truth, Jennifer's contact with Daniel grew strained. The quick texts that once carried warmth turned into short replies. His calls became less frequent, his tone more distracted. For Jennifer, who had already lost her freedom inside the Pan household, the thought of losing Daniel too was unbearable. At night, she clutched her phone under the blanket, staring at the screen, waiting for his name to light up. Sometimes the silence stretched for hours. Sometimes her messages were left unread. The anxiety chewed at her, feeding the fear that Daniel was slipping away. Each unanswered text felt like another reminder that she had nothing left. No school, no independence, no future she could control. And as her desperation deepened, her conversations with Daniel took a darker turn. She spoke of her parents constantly, of her father's cold glares, of her mother's tears that felt less like love and more like shame. She described the suffocating routines, the lockdown life she lived in silence. She told Daniel she couldn't breathe in that house, that every rule was a chain, every lecture a punishment. At first, Daniel listened quietly, letting her vent. But soon his responses shifted. He didn't dismiss her anger. Instead, he added to it. "They'll never let you go," he told her once. "Not unless something changes." That single line became a spark. The idea that something could change began as a whisper in Jennifer's mind, a half-formed fantasy spoken in the privacy of their late-night calls. If her parents weren't there, there would be no rules. If her parents were gone, there would be no barriers. With each conversation, the fantasy grew stronger. Daniel didn't laugh it off. He didn't tell her it was too far. Instead, he lingered in the thought with her. Together, they let the forbidden possibility take shape. Jennifer began to imagine details. She pictured a quiet home without her parents' watchful eyes, dinners without lectures, mornings without suspicion. She imagined walking freely beside Daniel, no longer sneaking through lies or hiding behind excuses. In her daydreams, freedom was no longer tied to honesty or confession. It was tied to absence, the absence of her parents. What had once been an intrusive thought began to feel like the only way out. Her anger, once muted, became sharper. She clenched her fists under the dinner table as her father questioned her whereabouts. She bit her lip until it bled when her mother reminded her of the shame she had brought on the family. She nodded when scolded, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying Daniel's words, rehearsing what life would be if they no longer had to obey. Every small conflict in the household poured fuel on the fire she and Daniel had lit. Daniel, too, leaned into the darkness. He began asking questions he hadn't before. What would you do if they weren't around? What would your life look like without them? His words weren't commands, but they were provocations, and Jennifer met them with eagerness. Together, they traced lines between fantasy and plan, blurring them with every exchange. What began as venting turned into strategy. What began as frustration turned into justification. Inside the Pan home, the tension was constant. Jennifer's parents believed strictness would repair what was broken. They restricted her movements, monitored her time, and forbade Daniel's presence. Each rule they enforced only deepened her resentment. Each tear from her mother, each stern glance from her father, made the idea of escape feel more necessary. She no longer saw them as parents trying to protect her. She saw them as obstacles that could be removed. Jennifer Pan had lived a life built on lies, but now the lie had become something darker. It was no longer about grades, or university, or success. It was about survival, or at least the survival she imagined for herself. And in the silence of her room, with Daniel's voice echoing in her ear, she crossed the line she could never return from. The fantasy of erasing her parents was no longer just a thought. It had begun to take root as a plan. By the fall of 2010, Jennifer Pan's life had narrowed to a single obsession: keeping Daniel warm. Her lies had collapsed, her parents kept her under constant watch, and Daniel, tired of secrets and chaos, was drifting away. His messages slowed, his calls grew shorter, and his patience with Jennifer's excuses was wearing thin. She feared not just loneliness, but the final loss of the only love she believed she had. And in that fear, the whispers of fantasy she and Daniel once toyed with hardened into something far darker. Daniel became more than a boyfriend. He became the link to the men who could make their whispered dream real. Through his connections, Jennifer was introduced to small-time criminals, men who lived on the margins of Toronto's underworld. They weren't professionals in the way television imagines killers. They were men used to quick money, drug deals, and stolen goods. But when Jennifer's offer was laid out, $10,000 to stage a home invasion where she would be spared and her parents would not, they didn't flinch. Murder, to them, was just another transaction. The plan was outlined with chilling simplicity. Jennifer would be home. The men would arrive. They would make it look like a robbery. She would survive as the traumatized daughter. Her parents would not. Jennifer promised she would leave the door unlocked to make entry easy, and she rehearsed the details in her mind as if preparing for a role. For someone who had spent years fabricating transcripts, graduation photos, and fake schedules, deception was second nature. But this deception required blood. Daniel assured her it could work. He told her the men were reliable, that they had handled dangerous jobs before. He described how quickly it would be over, how afterward they would finally be free. His words gave her courage, feeding the illusion that murder could be clean, almost mechanical. Jennifer listened, nodded, and agreed. Each time she replayed the plan, her heart raced, not with guilt, but with anticipation, as though freedom was already within reach. At home, the tragedy sharpened in silence. Hui-Han checked the locks each night, believing he was protecting his family. Bitch-Ha, still nursing heartbreak over Jennifer's deception, tried to show kindness through small gestures, a meal left on the table, a gentle reminder to rest. Neither parent knew that their daughter was plotting their deaths in the very rooms they worked so hard to build. They believed time and discipline would repair what was broken. Instead, their efforts became the very fuel for Jennifer's resentment. Jennifer prepared herself like an actress rehearsing lines. She practiced the panic tone she would use when dialing 911. She tried tears in front of her mirror, testing how her face looked when she cried. She whispered phrases, "They broke in, they shot my parents," until the words rolled off her tongue naturally. She imagined the police rushing in, finding her tied but alive, the perfect victim who had narrowly escaped. In her mind, she was already living the aftermath, already playing the role that would erase suspicion. The men who agreed to take the job weren't concerned with her guilt or her story. They asked about the money, not the morality. Jennifer promised it would be delivered. She spoke of savings, of insurance, of the future inheritance she expected. The men nodded, barely listening, their eyes on the prize. To them, it was quick cash. To Jennifer, it was freedom. Each party walked away believing they understood the deal. In truth, none of them fully grasped the storm they were unleashing. As the date drew closer, Jennifer grew quieter at home. She walked past her father locking the door, knowing she would one day leave it open. She sat across from her mother at dinner, forcing a faint smile while imagining the silence that would soon follow. She nodded at instructions, listened to lectures, and hid the darkest secret a daughter could hold. Outwardly, she was the obedient child they demanded. Inwardly, she was the architect of their destruction. Jennifer Pan believed she had engineered the perfect crime. She believed her tears could be rehearsed, her fear could be faked, and her role as victim could absolve her. But belief does not change reality. And as the plan settled into place, the question no longer was whether she could lie convincingly. It was how a daughter could stand in her own home, unlock her parents' door to killers, and still expect to walk away untouched. November 8, 2010. Markham, Ontario. The night was quiet, the kind of suburban calm that fools families into believing nothing could go wrong. The streetlights burned softly over trimmed lawns and parked cars, their glow muted by the cold air. Inside the Pan home, Hui-Han was settling into his evening routine, disciplined as always, while Bitch-Ha moved quietly through the house, tidying, preparing for rest. Upstairs, Jennifer sat in the dark with her phone glowing in her hands. Her thumb hovered before each text, her breath shallow as she typed the instructions that would turn her family home into a crime scene. The front door, her father's nightly ritual to secure, was left unlocked, just as she had promised. It was the single act of betrayal that opened the way. Around 10 p.m., 3 men slipped inside. Their steps were heavy on the tile, their voices low but edged with menace. One tugged a mask tighter over his face, another shifted the gun in his hand with casual familiarity. The smell of the cold night air drifted in behind them before the door shut, leaving only silence and danger. Jennifer, still upstairs, waited for the vibration of her phone confirming they had arrived. The violence began quickly. Hui-Han heard the disturbance first. Rising from his chair, he moved to confront the intruders, his instinct not to flee but to protect. A struggle erupted, sharp and chaotic. The crack of a gunshot shattered the stillness. The sound echoed off the walls, a sharp metallic ring followed by the groan of a man who refused to fall completely. Hui-Han collapsed, blood soaking his clothes, but his body resisted the call of death. Shot and broken, he clung stubbornly to life. Bicha had no chance. Cornered in her own home, she barely had time to cry out. A flash, a shot, and she was gone. Her body dropped where she stood. The years of sacrifice, of work, of quiet love ended in an instant. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and suffocating, mixing with the faint scent of the dinner she had cooked only hours earlier. Her final act was not a word but a presence, the mother who had given everything, silenced by her daughter's plan. Upstairs, Jennifer prepared her performance. One of the men tied her loosely to the banister, the rope slack enough to leave. Her hands free with effort, she pressed her wrists against the cord, adjusting until it looked convincing. Her heart pounded, not from fear of death, but from fear of discovery. She rehearsed the panic she had practiced, her mind recalling the phrases she had whispered to herself in the mirror. They broke in. They shot my parents. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling, not with grief, but with anticipation. The 911 call began.
People broke into our house and they showed us all his money. Ma'am.
Terrified daughter begging for help. She described masked men with guns, her parents attacked, herself bound and helpless. Every detail was delivered in tones of desperation. But beneath the quiver, there was a rhythm, too even, too deliberate, the sound of a story being told, not lived. It was a performance layered over reality, and in the chaos of that moment, no one on the other end of the line could know. When police arrived, the scene was confusion and horror. The front door was ajar, the house dim and disordered. Jennifer was found tied, her eyes wide, her cheeks wet with tears that seemed too well-timed. Her voice carried the panic of survival, yet her body showed no signs of struggle. Downstairs lay the truth. Hui-Han, bleeding but alive, his breath shallow, his body refusing surrender. And near him, the still form of his wife, Bicha, whose life had ended in the home she had worked so hard to build. Paramedics rushed to Hui-Han. His survival was improbable, yet he fought with every ounce of strength left in him. He would not die that night, though he had been meant to. His broken body carried the truth of what had happened, and in time, his words would tear apart the illusion Jennifer had tried to create. But on that night, the contrast was stark. The reality of blood and pain stood beside the performance of a daughter pretending to be spared. Jennifer Pan believed she had written a perfect script, a robbery staged, a daughter tied, a story ready for the police. But the script could not hide the details, the looseness of the rope, the rehearsed panic in her voice, the survival of a father who was never meant to speak again. And as the flashing lights filled the quiet Markham Street, Jennifer clutched her phone, her tears flowing on cue, while just beyond her reach, her father bled into the floorboards and her mother's body lay cold. The flashing lights turned the Pan family's quiet Markham home into a stage of chaos. Paramedics worked furiously over Hui-Han, their gloves slick with blood as they pressed into wounds meant to kill. The metallic scent of iron filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of dinner still lingering from hours before. Neighbors stood at a distance, hushed, watching a man who by all accounts should not still be alive. His chest rose in shallow bursts, his body trembling against the stretcher, but he clung to life with the stubborn discipline that had defined him for decades. Sirens wailed as he was rushed to the hospital, every second the difference between life and death. Inside the house, Jennifer wept loudly. Her cries pierced the air, so forceful they drowned out the quiet commands of police officers securing the scene. She told them she had been tied to the banister, forced to listen helplessly as her parents were attacked. Yet the ropes told a different story. They hung loosely from her wrists, barely tightened, leaving marks so faint they suggested performance rather than struggle. Officers noted the details silently, exchanging glances. It was the first sign that her tears might not match the truth. Detectives walked the rooms methodically. They expected overturned drawers, scattered jewelry, missing electronics. But the valuables sat untouched. A laptop rested neatly on the table. Cash lay in plain sight. Nothing had been taken, not even hastily. The living room was orderly, almost undisturbed, apart from the blood. To trained eyes, it was obvious. This had not been a robbery. It had been something else. Jennifer repeated her story, but detectives noticed the way she told it. Her sobs spiked whenever an officer stood close, but fell into silence when attention drifted away. She wrung her hands as if rehearsing grief, glancing quickly to gauge their reactions. Her eyes filled with tears on cue, then dried too quickly. Victims of real trauma struggled for coherence, often lost in confusion. Jennifer's account, by contrast, sounded memorized. Each phrase rolled out as though practiced in advance. Suspicion grew, quietly but steadily. At the hospital, Huihan's fight for survival became the thread investigators clung to. Surgeons worked through the night, repairing the damage from bullets that had torn through his face and shoulder. Machines beeped steadily, marking his fragile heartbeat. Doctors doubted he would make it through the week, yet his body resisted the final blow. Family friends prayed in the waiting room, their whispers heavy with despair. But slowly, against every expectation, Huihan stirred. His survival was not just a miracle. It was a problem for Jennifer's story. Back at the house, detectives debated. Could this still be a robbery gone wrong? Could intruders have panicked, killing without reason, and spared Jennifer by chance? Yet every detail contradicted that theory. The unlocked door suggested invitation, not break-in. The precision of the attack suggested planning, not chaos. And the only person spared was the one who had left the door open. They interviewed neighbors, hoping for answers. But no one had seen masked men running down the street, no suspicious vehicles speeding away. The night had been calm, too calm. It was as if the violence had been contained neatly within the Pan home, with no trace left for the outside world. That, too, pointed to something deliberate. As detectives pressed Jennifer for more detail, her story began to splinter. She repeated key points word for word, like a student clinging to a script. When asked about timing, she faltered. When asked to describe the intruders, she offered vague, generic images: men in black, masks, guns. Nothing unique, nothing concrete. And when her answers grew shaky, the tears returned, almost as if summoned on demand. The room grew tense. Detectives had seen this before. This was not grief. This was theater. Days later, Huihan began to communicate. His voice was weak, his words slurred, but his memory was sharp. He remembered his daughter that night. He remembered seeing her upstairs. And most damning of all, he remembered her speaking with one of the men, her voice not filled with terror, but with familiarity. The revelation, fragile but clear, tightened the net around Jennifer. She was no longer just suspicious. She was implicated. Still, investigators moved carefully. They could not rely on suspicion alone. They needed proof that tied Jennifer not only to the crime scene, but to the plan. Phone records became their next focus. They subpoenaed call logs, text histories, digital footprints. And what they uncovered began to form the outline of conspiracy. Jennifer's phone lit up with messages to Daniel Wong in the hours before the attack. Instructions, reassurances, confirmations. The timeline aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Even as suspicion mounted, Jennifer continued her act. At vigils, she cried into microphones, thanking the community for their support. At interviews, she sat with folded hands, speaking softly of trauma and grief. Cameras captured her tears, but detectives watching from behind the scenes compared them against the evidence. And the evidence was merciless. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not random. This was planned, deliberate, calculated. A daughter had unlocked her home to killers, staged her survival, and expected the world to believe. And as detectives spread her phone records across the table, her messages glowing like breadcrumbs leading to the truth, one question hung in the air. How much longer could Jennifer Pan keep performing before her own lies consumed her? Detectives called Jennifer Pan back for another round of questioning. By now, weeks had passed since the attack, and the daughter who had once presented herself as a trembling survivor was beginning to look less like a victim and more like a suspect. The questions came sharper this time, every detail picked apart. Jennifer stumbled. She insisted her bindings had been so tight she couldn't move, but officers reminded her the ropes left almost no marks. She swore the intruders had ransacked the house, yet photographs showed valuables untouched. She described noise and chaos, while neighbors reported silence. Piece by piece, her story frayed. Frustrated, detectives offered her a polygraph. Jennifer agreed, perhaps convinced she could outwit the machine as easily as she had once outwitted her parents. The test room was cold, quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the monitor. Electrodes were placed on her skin, a cuff tightened around her arm. Each question pressed closer to the truth. Did you plan the attack? Did you know the men who came into your home? Jennifer's answers came clipped, defensive, her breath shallow. The lines on the machine spiked and wavered. When the session ended, the examiner's look said everything. The result was clear. She had not told the truth. The polygraph wasn't admissible in court, but detectives didn't need it for evidence. They needed it for leverage. And leverage was exactly what it gave them. Jennifer left the room insisting she was innocent, but behind the glass, investigators felt the shift. She was no longer a daughter to be comforted. She was a suspect to be broken. Meanwhile, the investigation widened. Detectives began surveillance, watching Jennifer's movements, monitoring her calls, tracing her patterns. From parked cars down the street, they noted her late-night activity. Transcripts from her phone revealed something devastating. Jennifer was still in contact with Daniel Wong. Even as she played the role of grieving daughter for the public, she whispered reassurances to the man who had helped plan her parents' destruction. "Stay strong," one message read. "It will be okay," said another. The words didn't belong to a victim. They belonged to a partner in crime. The evidence stacked quickly. Phone records lined up perfectly with the timeline of the attack. Messages were exchanged minutes before the intruders arrived, then again once the violence was complete. It was as if Jennifer had been a conductor, orchestrating from her room while the men carried out the notes. Detectives spread the records across their desks, each message another thread in a web that left no doubt. This had not been random. It had been planned from the inside. And then came the moment no one expected. After weeks in a coma, after doctors had nearly given up, Hui Han Pan opened his eyes. His body was weak, his words halting, but his mind held on to the memory of that night. When investigators visited him, he forced the words out slowly, each syllable carrying the weight of betrayal. He told them he had seen his daughter, not tied, not panicking, standing at the top of the stairs, speaking to the intruders like she knew them. The room grew still as his statement was recorded. This was not speculation. This was not a theory. This was the memory of a man who had lost his wife, who had nearly lost his life, and who now had to face the truth that his own daughter had opened the door to murder. Tears welled in his eyes as he recalled it. The sound of her voice, calm in the chaos, words exchanged with men who should have been strangers. For him, the physical pain of his wounds was nothing compared to that realization. With Hui Han's testimony, the case shifted from suspicion to certainty. Detectives now had everything they needed: a father's memory, phone records, surveillance, and a polygraph that revealed deception. Jennifer's performance was crumbling under the weight of reality. Yet still, she tried to hold on. In public, she wept at vigils, her hands clasped in gratitude to the community. She thanked people for their support, her voice trembling on cue. But behind the scenes, detectives placed her phone logs beside her father's words, and the picture was undeniable. This was not grief. This was betrayal. And as Jennifer stood before candles and flowers, her tears glistening in the camera light, investigators quietly prepared the next step, the moment when her performance would finally end. The interrogation room was stark: white walls, a single table, 2 chairs, and a camera in the corner blinking red. Jennifer Pan sat with her hands folded, eyes darting between the detectives and the door. Across from her, 2 seasoned investigators leaned back in their chairs, voices steady, their patience calculated. This was not a battle of shouting or intimidation. It was hours of quiet pressure, questions asked in calm tones that cut deeper than anger ever could. At first, Jennifer clung to the same story she had carried for weeks: masked intruders, sudden violence, ropes that held her captive while her parents were attacked. She spoke quickly, her voice straining, as though speed could make her words sound convincing. One detective let the silence hang before asking softly, "If they were here for money, why didn't they take a thing?" Jennifer blinked, swallowed hard, and muttered something about panic. Her answer was weak. The first crack had appeared. As the hours dragged, the questions grew sharper. Why were your bindings so loose, Jennifer? Why didn't you scream? Why were you spared when your parents weren't? Each time, her replies shifted slightly, her story bending under pressure. Detectives slid photographs across the table. Untouched cash, jewelry still in boxes, electronics left neatly in place. One leaned forward, voice low. "This wasn't a robbery. You know it. And we know it." Jennifer's defenses faltered. Her hands twisted in her lap. Her eyes filled with tears, but the detectives didn't move to comfort her. Instead, they spread her phone records across the table, the printed logs glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Explain these," one said, tapping the page. Text to Daniel Wong, time-stamped minutes before the killers entered the house. Jennifer stared, silent, her breath shallow. When she spoke, her voice cracked. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Her story shifted again. She tried to cast Daniel as the mastermind, insisting he had pressured her, that she was just a girl desperate for love, forced into something she didn't fully understand. "I didn't want anyone hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Daniel made me believe. I had no choice." But the detectives didn't buy it. One leaned closer, speaking almost gently. "Jennifer, you weren't forced. You were planning." The words landed like a hammer. She dropped her gaze, unable to meet their eyes. Piece by piece, her admission slipped out. She acknowledged the conversations, admitted leaving the door unlocked, and conceded she had spoken with Daniel about making her parents go away. But even in confession, she tried to cloak herself in victimhood. "I just wanted the pressure to stop," she pleaded. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." It was the closest she came to truth, yet still wrapped in self-pity, still distant from the horror of what had happened to her family. The camera in the corner captured it all. Jennifer shifting in her chair, her face wet with tears that no longer carried conviction, her voice faltering as the detective's calm questions dismantled her lies. Later, when the footage was released, the public would watch in disbelief. The young woman once praised as the dutiful daughter of hard-working immigrants was now exposed as something very different, a manipulator caught in her own web. The perfect daughter had become the nation's cautionary tale. The arrest followed swiftly. Jennifer was led from the station in handcuffs, her head bowed, cameras flashing as reporters shouted her name. The images spread across screens and newspapers within hours. Neighbors shook their heads, struggling to reconcile the girl they had known with the woman accused of plotting her parents' murder. Community members who had once brought flowers and candles to the family home now whispered in disbelief. The betrayal cut deep, not just for her father, who had survived to name her, but for everyone who had admired the Pan family's sacrifices. Inside the interrogation room, before the world knew, the detectives had given her one last chance to speak. "Why, Jennifer?" one asked softly, almost like a father speaking to a child. She didn't answer. She lowered her head, silent, the truth too heavy to carry and too late to hide. And as the footage played on screens across Canada, the haunting image remained. Jennifer Pan in a cold room, her lies unraveling under calm questions, her silence finally louder than her words. The trial of Jennifer Pan opened in Toronto in 2014, nearly 4 years after the night her home in Markham turned into a killing ground. The courtroom was packed each morning, journalists scribbling in their notebooks, neighbors craning for a glimpse of the young woman they had once seen as quiet, polite, the pride of immigrant parents. The air was heavy, benches creaked under the weight of silence, and each time the clerk called the court to order, whispers died into tense expectation. Everyone knew they were about to hear the anatomy of a family's betrayal. Prosecutors wasted no time. They stood before the jury and laid out Jennifer's double life, a history not of one lie, but of years of deceit. They showed how deception had begun with forged grades, escalated into fake acceptances, and grown into a persona Jennifer carefully constructed for her parents and community. But the lies had not stopped at school or work. They argued the crime itself was the ultimate extension of that same pattern. One prosecutor told the jury, She rehearsed lies for years. This time, her lie was murder. The digital trail was next. Projected onto a screen for the jury, Jennifer's texts lit up like a confession in real time. Messages to Daniel Wong traced her thoughts, promises to leave the door unlocked, reassurances that the killers would be paid, final confirmations on the night of the attack. Call logs and payment transfers built the case brick by brick. Jurors shifted uneasily as the paper trail showed intent, calculation, and timing too exact to ignore. Then came the testimony. One of the hired men described the arrangement bluntly. He said Jennifer promised $10,000, instructed them to make it look like a robbery, and demanded that her parents not survive. His words were flat, almost casual, but the weight of them was unbearable. Another accomplice spoke of Jennifer's calmness, how she seemed more concerned about being spared than about the violence itself. Their testimonies stripped away any doubt that this had been chaos. It had been planned. Daniel Wong followed. The man Jennifer had once described as her escape now sat under oath, his voice steady but defensive. He admitted their relationship, admitted the late-night calls, admitted reaching out to men who could carry out what Jennifer wanted. But he shifted the burden onto her. She was the one who kept pushing, he said. She wanted her parents gone. I just went along. The jury watched closely, weighing his words. Was he protecting himself, or was he speaking the truth? Jennifer's presence in the courtroom became its own performance. She rarely cried. She rarely looked at her father, who sat in the gallery, his body still bearing the scars of bullets meant to kill him. When her mother's death was described, she did not flinch. Instead, she sat with her hands folded neatly, her eyes cast downward, whispering occasionally to her lawyers. To prosecutors, her composure was chilling. To the defense, it was proof of numbness, of a young woman overwhelmed by grief she could not express. The defense built their case around that narrative. They argued Jennifer was not a mastermind, but a desperate daughter, broken under the weight of her parents' strict expectations and manipulated by a controlling boyfriend. They described Daniel as the driving force, the one with connections to men willing to kill. They pleaded with the jury to see Jennifer not as calculating, but as cornered, a girl who made terrible choices because she saw no way out. But prosecutors countered with precision. They reminded the jury that Jennifer had been lying long before Daniel entered her life. They replayed her 911 call, noting its unnatural rhythm, its rehearsed tones. They pointed to the fact that after her mother's death, Jennifer had continued texting Daniel in secret, offering him comfort rather than remorse. And most damning of all, they returned to her father's testimony, how he had seen his daughter speaking freely with the attackers while he lay bleeding on the floor. One prosecutor ended with words that echoed in the silence. Victims don't orchestrate. Victims don't unlock doors for killers. The trial stretched on for weeks. Witness after witness testified, neighbors, digital analysts, experts on deception. Each layer added weight. And with each passing day, Jennifer sat quietly, showing little emotion. Some jurors saw her stillness as defiance. Others wondered if it was emptiness, the hollow quiet of someone who had lived in lies so long she no longer knew how to be real. When closing arguments arrived, the room was electric. The prosecution asked the jury to see Jennifer Pan not as a naive daughter, but as a cold planner whose lies had escalated into a plot for murder. They held up her phone records and said, "This is her voice. Not fear, not panic. Planning." The defense countered with equal passion, pleading that Jennifer had been a young woman in love, manipulated, trapped, desperate to escape a cage her parents had built. She is guilty of poor choices, they argued, but not of masterminding murder. As the judge gave instructions and the jury filed out to deliberate, the courtroom sat in silence. Reporters tapped quietly, family members held their breath, and Jennifer sat with her head bowed, hands still, her face unreadable. The door to the jury room closed with a heavy thud, leaving only the echo of her deception behind. The jury deliberated for 4 long days. Inside that private room, 12 ordinary people carried the weight of extraordinary responsibility. Some argued Jennifer Pan had been swept into the conspiracy by Daniel Wong, a desperate lover who promised freedom. Others saw her as the careful architect, the one who unlocked the door and set the plan in motion. Back and forth they went, voices rising, silence is heavy. But in the end, the evidence was too strong, too precise, too damning to ignore. When the jury filed back into the Toronto courtroom, the air thickened. Wooden benches creaked as neighbors leaned forward, and even the shuffle of papers stopped. The foreperson stood, paper trembling in hand, and in a voice tight with gravity, announced the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of attempted murder, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The words echoed in the chamber like iron doors slamming shut. The judge pronounced her sentence with measured clarity. Life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, the maximum penalty under Canadian law. Jennifer would not see freedom until she was nearly 50 years old. For a young woman who had once forged a future of promise and prestige, the reality was brutal. Her life would be measured not in milestones, but in years behind bars. Daniel Wong stood to hear his own fate. His testimony had done little to save him. The jury convicted him as well, and the judge matched Jennifer's sentence. Life in prison, no parole for 25 years. His eyes flickered briefly toward Jennifer as the words were read, but she never looked back. The connection that had once fueled their conspiracy now dissolved into silence. The hitmen, too, faced their reckoning. Each was sentenced to life imprisonment, their names etched into the record beside the crime that had shocked the nation. Reporters noted the contrast. Some bowed their heads, resigned to years lost, while others scowled at the gallery, defiant to the end. For the community, there was no sympathy. They had invaded a home, shattered a family, and taken a mother's life for a promise of money that never truly came. Now, they would vanish into prison walls, their lives wasted in service of someone else's deception. And then, the courtroom shifted to the most haunting moment of all. With visible effort, Hui Han Pan rose from his seat. A cane supported his body, still weakened by the bullets that tore through him. Scars marked his skin, and his gait was unsteady, but his voice, though low and strained, carried the force of truth. The room quieted until every ear bent toward him. He spoke of his wife, Bitch Ha, the woman who had stood beside him through years of sacrifice, who had worked nights in the factory to build a future for their children. His words faltered when he described her absence at the dinner table, her empty side of the bed, the silence where her laughter once lived. He spoke of his injuries. The pain that lingered in his body each morning, the tasks he could no longer perform, the permanent reminder of that night carved into his very flesh. And then he spoke of Jennifer. His voice cracked, and tears welled, but he did not turn away from the truth. My daughter, he said slowly, was supposed to protect our family name. Instead, she destroyed it. I lost my wife. I lost my daughter. And I lost the life we worked so hard to build. What remains is only grief. His words hung in the courtroom, heavy, unbearable, and for a long moment, no one moved. Even the judge lowered his gaze. Jennifer did not respond. She did not rise, did not apologize, did not reach for her father's eyes. She sat still, her hands folded, her face blank. To some, it was defiance. To others, emptiness. But to Hui Han, it was confirmation. The daughter who had lied, who had betrayed, who had orchestrated his wife's murder, had nothing left to give but silence. The trial ended that day, but the echoes lingered. A mother buried, a father maimed, a daughter condemned, a family forever broken. The sentences offered justice, but they could not offer healing. As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushed to file stories, neighbors whispered prayers, and Hui Han walked slowly toward the doors, his cane tapping against the floor, the seat beside him forever empty. Behind him, guards led Jennifer away in handcuffs, her future sealed by the verdict of 12 strangers and the lies she could no longer outrun. In the years after the trial, Hui Han Pan lived a life marked by loss and survival in equal measure. His injuries never fully healed. Each step with his cane was a reminder of the bullets that should have ended his life. But the deeper pain was not in his body. It was in his home. His wife's voice no longer echoed through the rooms. The daughter he had once worked endless hours to support was now serving a life sentence. Each morning he set a single cup on the table, where once there had been 3, and he carried the knowledge that he was mourning a wife buried in the earth and a daughter buried behind prison walls. Neighbors recalled seeing him walk slowly down the streets of Markham, his shoulders heavy, his eyes fixed on the ground. The once proud father who had spoken of his daughter's future now avoided conversations, unwilling to repeat a story too painful to tell. A man who had embodied the immigrant dream now embodied its darkest consequence, the realization that even sacrifice, discipline, and love cannot always shield a family from destruction. The Vietnamese Canadian community felt the impact like a wound of its own. Vigils were held in the weeks after the sentencing. Families gathered in church halls and community centers, candles flickering as prayers were whispered for Bich Ha's soul and for the strength of her surviving husband. At those gatherings, parents spoke in low voices about fear and regret. Some confessed they had demanded too much of their children, that perfection had become a substitute for love. Others insisted that strictness was necessary, that discipline had carried them through poverty and hardship. In those circles, Jennifer Pan's name became both a warning and a question, a reminder of what can happen when silence grows between generations. Nationally, the case sparked heated debate. Some commentators pointed to the dangers of unyielding parental pressure. Psychologists noted how children raised in fear of failure often learn deception as survival. One headline read, "When success becomes a prison," capturing the way Jennifer's achievements had been illusions built on lies. But others resisted that framing. They argued that responsibility must still rest on Jennifer's choices, that countless children face strict expectations without plotting their parents' deaths. In classrooms, university dorms, and family kitchens, the arguments played out. Was Jennifer a victim of cultural expectations, or simply a manipulator who chose betrayal? Generational conflict sat at the center of it all. Immigrant parents saw their sacrifices as love, a language of hard work and survival. Their children, raised between tradition and Western freedom, often saw it as control. Jennifer Pan's story became the most extreme illustration of that divide. For some young people, it was proof of how crushing silence between parents and children could become. For others, it was a lesson in accountability, a warning that choices born of lies will always find their reckoning. And yet, behind the headlines and debates, the human truth remained simple. A woman was dead. A father was permanently disabled, his nights haunted by memory. A daughter sat in prison, her youth exchanged for years behind steel doors. The family that had once stood as a symbol of sacrifice now stood as a symbol of tragedy. Jennifer Pan remains incarcerated, her earliest chance at parole still years away. By then, she will be middle-aged, the world outside changed beyond recognition. Whether she will ever express remorse, or whether she will seek forgiveness from her father, remains uncertain. For Hui Han, the question is even heavier. Would forgiveness ever be possible? Or would silence remain the final bond between father and daughter? The Pan family home still stands in Markham, its walls bearing no scars visible to the eye, but its history impossible to erase. For neighbors, it is not haunted by spirits, but by memory, the memory of an immigrant dream that unraveled from the inside out. And so the story of Jennifer Pan does not end neatly with a verdict or a sentence. It ends in the lingering silence of a father eating dinner alone, of a community questioning its values, of a country forced to look at the cost of ambition and the fragility of trust. As the screen fades, one image remains: a father leaning on his cane, leaving the courthouse into a cold Canadian winter, the seat beside him empty, the echo of his daughter's lies following him into the night. Was Jennifer Pan a victim of expectations no one could meet, or a manipulative killer who turned lies into weapons? That is the question that lingers, the one that no verdict can answer fully. Some see her as a young woman crushed by rules, silence, and a desperate hunger for love. Others see only calculation, the daughter who planned her mother's murder while pretending to mourn. The truth, perhaps, lives somewhere in the uneasy space between the two. For her mother, Bich Ha, there was no second chance. She was a woman who worked long factory hours, who pinched pennies so her children could have what she never did. She built a home, dreamed of grandchildren, and imagined a quieter life with her husband after years of sacrifice. Instead, she died in her own living room, at the hands of men her daughter had invited inside. Every immigrant hope she had carried for decades ended in the crack of gunfire that night. For Hui Han, the cost was doubled. He survived, but survival brought its own punishment. His cane marked each step with the sound of pain, his body scarred by the bullets meant to finish him. Yet the deeper wound was betrayal. He had looked up through blood and confusion and seen his daughter speaking calmly to the men who came to kill him. He did not just bury his wife. He lost his daughter at that moment too. And for Jennifer, the price is a life behind bars. She will spend her 20s, 30s, and 40s counting years in a cell, her youth traded for silence and routine. By the time parole is even possible, she will be nearly 50, stepping into a world that has moved on without her. Whether she will ever seek forgiveness, whether her father would ever give it, remains a question as haunting as the crime itself. The Vietnamese Canadian community felt the shock like a fracture. Vigils filled with candles and soft prayers were held in Markham, neighbors gathering to honor Bich Ha and to steady Hui Han. Parents whispered to each other at those gatherings, wondering if they, too, demanded too much from their children, if discipline had blurred into pressure. Young people whispered as well, some saying Jennifer's lies reminded them of their own secrets, others insisting nothing could excuse such betrayal. What had once been a story of immigrant triumph became a warning passed from one family to another. Across Canada, the debate spread wider. Headlines asked, when success becomes a prison and tiger parenting or tragedy. Psychologists warned that when failure is not allowed, deception becomes survival. Others pushed back, reminding the country that millions of children face strict parents without plotting murder. In classrooms and family kitchens, the argument played out. Was Jennifer Pan the product of pressure or the architect of her own ruin? But when the arguments are quiet, what remains are facts no one can escape. A mother's life was stolen, a father scarred in body and soul, a daughter condemned to spend most of her life behind bars, a family, once bound by sacrifice, destroyed from within. Jennifer Pan's lies did not just take her mother's life. They shattered the very family her parents had built from sweat, hope, and years of sacrifice. And now, the final question belongs to you. What do you believe? Was Jennifer Pan the tragic product of impossible expectations, or a cold-blooded manipulator who chose murder when lies were no longer enough?